On Christmas morning, I sat stiffly on the beige sofa in the Miller living room, the scent of artificial pine mixed with the faint smoke from the fireplace and the rustle of wrapping paper surrounding me. Multicolored lights blinked across the tree and reflected on the polished glass of the windows. My sister Sophie, only 18, squealed with delight as my father Richard and mother Linda presented her with a large white envelope. She tore it open, manicured nails flashing, and inside gleamed a set of keys. Dad grinned with pride. Mom clasped her hands as if in prayer, and Sophie jumped to her feet, screaming. A BMW. A new car with a giant red bow sat in the driveway, glistening like snow polished by the heavens. Everyone clapped except me. My parents looked at Sophie as though she had achieved something holy, their faces lit with adoration. She twirled around the room, waving the keys, perfume heavy in the air, her laughter cutting into me like glass. I lowered my eyes to my own lap where a small package had been placed. Torn wrapping paper revealed a plastic piggy bank shaped like a cartoon pig. The price tag still clung to the bottom, $1.99. My chest tightened as I forced my fingers to open the stopper. 2 crisp $1 bills fluttered into my hand. Dad chuckled and said it was the start of my future home fund. Responsible Anna always knows how to save, not like some people. He winked at Sophie and she giggled, pretending to be insulted. The sound stabbed through me sharper than the winter wind. 30 seconds stretched like hours. My Toyota Corolla sat outside old but reliable the car I had worked 2 jobs to pay off. Sophie received a luxury car worth more than I could ever dream of. I received $2. My pulse hammered. My breath caught. I looked at their faces. Dad smug, Mom radiant, Sophie smug in her glittering sweater. Rage rose inside me, but deeper than rage was a heavy stone of despair, the weight of 20 years of moments just like this one. I whispered, "Thank you," my voice trembling. Sophie leaned toward me, patted my knee as if I were a child, and said she would drive me around whenever I needed. She smelled of expensive perfume, the kind I could never afford. Her words felt like knives hidden inside honey. The tree lights blurred before my eyes. I lifted my gaze to my father, expecting perhaps a flicker of recognition at how unfair this was. Instead, he frowned. "Why are you looking like that, Anna?" he barked. "Be grateful. Sophie deserves this. She has clients now. She has an image to maintain." My lips parted. My throat burned, and before I could speak, my father's hand came crashing down across my face. The slap echoed in the decorated room. My head snapped to the side, cheek stinging, eyes watering not from tears, but from the sheer force. Mom gasped, but not in defense of me. She said, "Richard, please calm down. It is Christmas. Not stop hurting her, but simply calm down." Sophie laughed nervously and twisted the keys again as if nothing had happened. I sat frozen, skin on fire, blood roaring in my ears. My father loomed over me, jaw tight, his eyes demanding submission. My mother's eyes warned me to stay silent. The humiliation was suffocating. Yet something changed in that moment. Instead of breaking, I felt myself harden. The sting on my face turned into clarity. The hollow ache in my chest crystallized into a cold decision. I lifted my eyes, slowly locking them with my father's. My face was calm, too calm, and that frightened him more than my tears ever could. He expected me to shrink, to apologize, to swallow the pain as I had done for years. Instead, I sat, straight, my hands still on the piggy bank, the $2 lying on my lap like a verdict. I said nothing, but my silence screamed louder than words. The room shifted. Sophie glanced away uncomfortable. My mother fidgeted with the hem of her blouse. My father grunted and returned to his chair, muttering about respect. The lights continued blinking, the radio played a cheerful carol, and the smell of pine turned sour in my nostrils. My cheek throbbed, but inside me something new burned. I glanced at the old grandfather clock against the wall. The hands pointed to 10 in the morning. In 12 hours, that clock would strike 2 again, and I would be gone. My decision settled over me like armor. They had made their choice. Now, I would make mine. The Miller family looked perfect from the outside, a respectable Portland household with a large two-story home decorated neatly for every holiday, yet behind the curtains, the truth was nothing close to perfection. Richard Miller, my father, carried himself like a man who believed he owned not only the house, but every soul inside it. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a permanent scowl that deepened whenever I spoke, he controlled every dollar, every schedule, every decision. Money was his weapon and his pride. He paid for Sophie's clothes, her lessons, her trips abroad, her new car. But when I asked for help with textbooks, he scoffed and said a smart girl like me should find scholarships. His voice often boomed through the house, full of lectures about gratitude and discipline. Yet when he lost his temper, which was often, his hand was quicker than his mouth. One slap could end an argument, one glare could silence my mother. Linda. My mother appeared softer. She played the part of the delicate homemaker, always sighing about stress, always wringing her hands as if she were the victim. In truth, she mastered manipulation. When my father hit me, she rarely intervened. Instead, she whispered that I should not provoke him, that I should be more like Sophie, that I should understand his stress. She could twist any situation until I felt guilty for even breathing. She called it keeping peace, but it was gaslighting, pure and simple. She favored Sophie so openly that neighbors noticed. Sophie, only 18, was the jewel of the family. Spoiled since birth, she learned quickly that charm and tears could win her anything. She played the innocent when she wanted new clothes, the ambitious artist when she wanted travel money, and the dutiful daughter when she wanted a BMW. She smirked at my efforts, rolled her eyes when I studied, and reminded me daily that she was the star while I was only the shadow. To her, I was not a sister, but a background prop that made her shine brighter. In contrast, I, Anna Miller, 20 years old, spent my nights working at a small cafe near campus and my mornings rushing to architecture classes at the university. I balanced student loans, part-time work, and projects that kept me awake until dawn. I loved architecture because it felt solid, something I could build with my own two hands when everything else in my life was fragile. Yet even my proudest achievements passed unnoticed. When I received a scholarship, my parents called it luck. When I designed a project that won praise from my professor, they said Sophie could have done it if she had tried. The gulf between us was not just about money, it was about recognition. They poured everything into Sophie's dreams while treating mine as chores. The contrast was sharpest during holidays. Sophie flaunted new outfits bought by Dad while I wore thrift store sweaters. At dinners, Sophie's stories of boyfriends and trips were met with laughter, while my stories of exams and late-night work were met with yawns. Even my grandmother once whispered that I was the strong one, but strength without support feels like punishment. My only refuge was my friend Rachel Torres. Rachel was 21, a fellow student in the architecture program, and unlike anyone in my family, she listened without judgment. With warm brown eyes and a quick wit, she often teased me out of dark moods. She knew about my father's temper, about my mother's coldness, about Sophie's cruelty, because she had witnessed phone calls where my voice cracked and visits where bruises on my arms peeked from under sleeves. She told me that family was not defined by blood, but by choice, and she proved it by showing up whenever I needed a ride, a study partner, or simply a hug. In her tiny Seattle apartment filled with mismatched furniture and posters, I felt more at home than in the Miller mansion. The contrast grew unbearable. Sophie received tuition fully covered by Dad, along with trips to Europe for inspiration. I signed loan papers alone in a financial office, heart-pounding with the knowledge I would be paying them back for decades. When I asked Dad why the difference, he said Sophie needed time to find herself, and I was responsible enough to manage on my own. Responsible became their code word for neglected. Every time they said it, a part of me shriveled, but another part hardened. That Christmas morning when the BMW keys landed in Sophie's hand and the piggy bank landed in mine, it was not just one more insult. It was the culmination of 20 years of being overlooked, belittled, and bruised. I looked at my family and realized I was not invisible. I was deliberately diminished. Sophie smirked. Linda sighed dramatically. Richard barked his commands, and Anna sat there with a swollen cheek and the weight of clarity pressing down. They would never change, not for me. The decision forming inside me that day was not sudden, it was born of years of imbalance, of tiny cuts that finally bled into one wound too deep to ignore. Memory is cruel because it does not fade when you want it to. It returns with the sharpness of glass cutting open wounds you thought had scarred. The sight of Sophie twirling with BMW keys in her hand dragged me back to my 10th birthday. I had waited for weeks imagining balloons games, maybe a cake with pink frosting, because I had worked hard at school and believed birthdays were supposed to feel special. Instead, the living room was bare except for a grocery store sheet cake half frozen, its icing cracked, and two friends from school sitting awkwardly at the kitchen table. Sophie had turned 9 just months before, and she had a backyard full of rented ponies, professional decorations, and 30 kids shouting with delight while photographers captured every smile. Dad said Sophie needed the social stimulation while I was independent and did not need such extravagance. Independent was his code for you do not matter as much. The second memory came from my high school graduation. I stood on the stage valedictorian of my class, delivering a carefully written speech about persistence, about building dreams brick by brick. I searched the crowd for familiar faces. The family section was empty, not a single Miller in sight. When I asked later where they had been, Mom explained that Sophie's junior varsity soccer team had an away game and she needed encouragement. My VHS recording sat untouched on my dresser until I left for college, the applause of strangers preserved, while the absence of my parents echoed louder than any cheer. The third flashback belongs to my freshman year of college. I sat in the financial aid office signing loan documents with trembling hands, committing myself to decades of repayment. The counselor smiled politely, unaware that just across town, Sophie was preparing for her fully funded semester of exploration. Her tuition paid her flights to Europe, covered by Dad. He said she needed to find herself, that travel was part of her education, while I was expected to balance work and study. I remember sitting in my dorm room, fluorescent light, flickering, counting pennies to buy ramen while photos of Sophie in Paris flooded social media. She posed in front of the Eiffel Tower while I stacked trays in the campus cafeteria. The unfairness was not just financial, it was spiritual. It told me over and over that her dreams mattered and mine did not. The fourth memory cut the deepest. I was 17 and bold enough to argue with Dad about Sophie skipping chores. My voice rose trembling but determined, and his hand flew faster than thought. The slap spun me sideways, left my ear ringing, and Mom rushed forward not to protect me but to scold me. "You made him lose his temper, Anna," she whispered. "You embarrassed him. You should be more careful." That night, I stared into the mirror, cheek burning red, and repeated her words to myself until I almost believed them. I made him lose his temper. I embarrassed him. But deep inside, I knew the truth. His violence was not my fault. Their favoritism was not my fault. The flashbacks crashed one into another, painting the same pattern. Sophie celebrated, I minimized. Sophie supported, I ignored. Sophie forgiven, I punished. I carried these memories like heavy stones in my backpack, pretending they did not weigh me down until Christmas morning when $2 landed in my lap and the sting of my father's hand reignited every stone at once. What I had once hoped might change now became undeniable proof. I had whispered to myself for years that maybe one day they would see me. Maybe one day I would be enough, but the memories proved otherwise. Every holiday, every milestone, every moment that should have been shared. Joy turned into another lesson that I was second best or not even in the running. Sitting there with my cheek burning, I felt those flashbacks line up like soldiers reminding me that invisibility was not accidental. It was engineered. The hope I once clung to crumbled. What replaced it was not just pain, but a strange clarity. The piggy bank with 2 bills was not a mistake. It was the symbol of everything they had ever believed about me. Worth less, worth little worth $2. The memories no longer whispered lies. They screamed the truth. When the sting of my father's slap finally dulled to a throbbing ache, I rose from the sofa with movements slow and deliberate, as though I were walking underwater. My mother's eyes followed me cool and detached, while Sophie spun her keys again, humming along with the Christmas carol still playing on the radio. I did not speak. If I opened my mouth, the weight of 20 years would come spilling out in screams. Instead, I climbed the staircase, every creak of the wooden steps sounding like a drumbeat of humiliation. At the top, I turned into my bedroom, closed the door, and twisted the lock. Only then did I let my knees weaken. The room was the same childhood space I had known for years, pale wallpaper with faded stars. A desk stacked with old notebooks, a narrow bed pressed against the wall. Yet in that moment, it felt like a prison cell, the bars invisible but real. I walked to the mirror above my dresser. The reflection staring back was almost unrecognizable. My cheek still flushed crimson, the outline of his hand visible in the swelling. My lips pressed together in a line so thin they disappeared. I lifted a hand and touched the skin, the heat spreading into my fingertips, and whispered to myself no more. The words barely made a sound, but they carried the weight of a vow. My chest rose and fell rapidly, my breath uneven as if concrete blocks pressed against my ribs. I expected tears, but none came. The well inside me had dried long ago. What rose instead was pressure-dense and suffocating building behind my sternum. I paced the room, my hands trembling, then stopped when my eyes landed on the small piggy bank on the nightstand. The ridiculous plastic pig bought for less than $2 mocked me with its bright cartoon smile. Inside lay the 2 bills my parents had called the start of a future. My vision blurred as I stared at it, not from tears, but from fury. That object became the symbol of my worth in this family. $2. I remembered every flashback, every slight, every time they told me I was independent. Strong, capable, as if those words excused their neglect. The pig was not just plastic, it was a mirror reflecting the truth. I picked it up, felt its cheap, hollow body against my palm, and considered smashing it against the wall. But I stopped. Something inside me told me to keep it not as a gift, but as evidence, as proof that I had not imagined their cruelty. I set it back down carefully, the hollow thud echoing in the stillness. I sat on the bed and listened to the sounds downstairs. Laughter, plates clinking, Sophie squealing again as Mom described the BMW. A W's leather seats. Not once did anyone come up to check on me to ask if I was all right. My cheek pulsed with pain, my heart even more so. It was the silence after violence that hurt the most, the confirmation that my suffering was background noise to their celebration. I turned to the old grandfather clock ticking faintly down the hall. The hands pointed toward 10:30. In the dark quiet of my room, I imagined them moving forward, hours passing until the hands circled back to 2 in the morning. That image filled me with strange calm. 2 in the morning would be my moment. I would not confront them tonight. I would not scream or beg. I would leave. I would walk away from this house, from the chains of their control, from the endless cycle of favoritism and violence. For the first time, I allowed myself to picture life beyond these walls. An apartment of my own silence that was peaceful, not punishing people who saw me not as a shadow, but as someone worth loving. The thought felt impossible, yet liberating. My pulse slowed. My breath steadied. My decision hardened like cement. Tonight would be the last night I slept under this roof. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the slap, the laughter, the piggy bank, letting the anger fuel resolve instead of despair. They had written my worth in 2 bills. I would rewrite it myself. The hours crawled by in suffocating silence, broken only by the faint sounds of laughter rising from the living room. I lay stiff on my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling where faint water stains had formed into cloud-like shapes, listening to the steady tick of the clock that counted down the minutes to my escape. My phone vibrated once, startling me. For a moment, I feared it was my father checking to see if I was still obediently sulking, but when I reached for it, Rachel's name glowed across the screen. I hesitated before answering. My fingers, trembling, the warmth of her voice spilling into the room like sunlight after days of rain. "Anna," she said gently, "what's wrong?" Your voice message sounded broken. My throat tightened. I tried to speak, but words tangled into silence. She waited patient as always, until finally I whispered, "He hit me again this morning in front of everyone." My voice cracked the sound alien in my own ears. Rachel inhaled sharply on the other end, then steadied herself. "Anna, you cannot keep living like this." Her tone was firm, not pitying, and that steadiness held me together when I felt I might unravel. I told her about the BMW, about the $2 piggy bank, about the slap that burned hotter than fire. Each word spilled like shards of glass, cutting my tongue. But Rachel listened without interruption. She said softly, "You deserve more than this. You always have." I whispered back, "I cannot just leave. They pay part of my tuition. What if I lose everything? What if I have nowhere to go?" My doubts spilled out like water from a cracked vase. Rachel responded with a certainty that shook me. "Come here," she said. "Come stay with me. You know I will not let you drown." I closed my eyes, clutching the phone, picturing her small Seattle apartment with its cluttered coffee table and smell of cinnamon tea, a place that felt warmer than this mansion ever had. Fear clawed at me. I imagined Dad's fury if he discovered I had left Mom's theatrics about her fragile nerves, Sophie's mocking laughter. The thought of cutting ties felt like stepping into an abyss. Rachel seemed to sense my hesitation. "Anna family is supposed to love, not wound. Blood is not a free pass to destroy you. The family you choose matters more than the family you are born into." Her words pierced through the fog of doubt. I had spent my life believing family meant obligation even when it came with bruises and silence. Hearing her say otherwise cracked something open inside me. Still, I whispered, "I do not know if I can. I am scared." She answered, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving despite it. Come, let me help." My chest tightened with both terror and longing. No one had ever said those words to me before. Let me help. In my house, help always flowed one way toward Sophie, toward my parents, never toward me. The realization almost knocked the breath from me. Rachel broke the silence again, firmer now. "Pack tonight. Leave when they are asleep. Text me when you are on the road. I will stay awake until you arrive." Her determination carried across the miles, steady as an anchor. My eyes burned finally with tears I had held back all day, silent streams sliding down my cheeks. I whispered, "Thank you." She replied, "No thanks needed, just come." After we hung up, I sat in the dim room holding the phone against my chest. The fear remained, but beneath it flickered a fragile flame of hope. My heart still pounded with dread of what leaving would cost me, but the thought of Rachel's open door and steady voice gave me a destination, a lifeline. The laughter from downstairs drifted up again, sharp and cruel. They were celebrating without me as though I were invisible, but in that invisibility I found clarity. I was not alone. Someone wanted me safe. The decision grew stronger. 2 o'clock would not just be an ending. It would be the first step toward a life where I was wanted. The night stretched endlessly, each tick of the grandfather clock a reminder that the moment of departure drew closer. I sat on my bed, fully dressed, a small duffel bag at my feet. My phone clutched in my hand, with Rachel's last message glowing on the screen, a simple line that read, "I am awake. I will be waiting." My heartbeat thrummed louder than the muffled voices drifting up from downstairs, where my parents and Sophie still laughed, unaware that their daughter was planning to vanish from their control forever. At 1:45, I rose slowly, careful not to make the floorboards creak too loudly, and began to gather the few items that mattered. I packed a change of clothes, a notebook filled with sketches, the worn stuffed bear my grandmother had once given me, and the plastic piggy bank with $2 inside. I slipped it into the bag, not as a gift, but as evidence of the truth I had lived. The rest I left behind. All the expensive gifts I had bought them with my meager wages stayed neatly wrapped under the tree, forgotten by everyone but me. My hand trembled as I turned the lock on my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house felt eerily alive, shadows shifting across the walls from the blinking lights downstairs. I tiptoed past the family portraits, each frame dominated by Sophie's smiling face, my own image barely visible at the edges. My chest tightened. Soon, those frames would hold the story of my absence, a story they would twist as they always did. But this time, I would not be there to hear it. The staircase groaned softly under my weight, every step a test of courage. I paused, halfway listening. My father's heavy snore rumbled faintly from the master bedroom. My mother's soft murmur followed. Sophie's phone chimed once with a message before silence returned. I moved on, my pulse racing faster. At the base of the stairs, the living room glowed faintly from the dying embers in the fireplace. The BMW keys still lay proudly displayed on the coffee table beside half-empty glasses of wine. I stared at them for a long moment, fury burning, but I did not touch them. That car was not mine to take, nor mine to envy. It was the symbol of favoritism I was finally refusing to chase. Instead, I stepped into the kitchen, placed my house key gently on the counter beside the coffee maker, and whispered goodbye, though no one could hear me. The metallic clink seemed louder than thunder, a declaration that I was no longer theirs to command. Outside, the December air bit into my skin sharp and cold. Snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes swirling in the pale light of the street lamps. My Toyota Corolla waited at the curb, frost covering its windshield, old and weary but loyal. I slid into the driver's seat, the cracked vinyl cold against my palms, and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared quietly to life. Relief flooded me, mingled with fear that someone would wake and storm outside to drag me back. The clock on the dashboard glowed 2:01. My chest rose and fell as if for the first time I was breathing freely. I glanced once more at the house. Behind the curtains, the Christmas tree still twinkled, mocking me with its forced cheer. My cheek still throbbed where my father's hand had struck, but now that pain fueled resolve. I whispered to myself, this ends tonight. I shifted into drive, the tires crunching against fresh snow, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The streets of Portland lay silent, the world asleep, while I broke free. Each block I passed loosened the chain a little more. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale as fear and freedom collided inside me. Tears blurred the road, not of sadness, but of release. For the first time in 20 years, the distance between me and that house was growing, and with every mile I reclaimed something they had stolen. My phone buzzed once on the seat beside me. A text from Rachel. "Drive safe. I am here." My lips trembled into a smile as I pressed forward into the night snow, swirling like confetti for the beginning of a life I was finally choosing. The highway carried me north through the fading night, the snowstorm thinning into scattered flurries, the silence inside the car broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the faint buzz of my phone against the passenger seat. By dawn, I crossed into Washington, exhaustion tugging at my eyelids, but the thought of Rachel's apartment kept me awake. When I finally parked outside her modest brick building in Seattle, the sky glowed faint pink and the city stirred with morning traffic. Rachel opened the door before I even knocked, pulling me into a hug so tight my frozen bones thawed. She did not ask why my cheek was swollen. She did not scold me for arriving unannounced. She simply said, "Welcome home." For the first time, those words meant safety, not obligation. Her apartment was small walls lined with books, mismatched furniture, the aroma of cinnamon tea lingering in the air. She made me sit, wrapped me in a blanket, and pressed a warm mug into my hands. My body shook from fatigue and release, and finally tears spilled hot and unstoppable. Rachel listened as I told her everything from the BMW keys to the slap to the piggy bank. She placed her hand over mine and said firmly, "Anna, you are free now. You do not have to carry them anymore." That day, I slept for 12 straight hours, the first real rest I had taken in years. The following morning, reality set in. I could not live on Rachel's couch forever. I searched job boards between classes, sending resumes for part-time drafting work, determined to prove I could stand on my own. Rachel insisted I meet her friend Dr. Elaine Foster, a therapist in her 50s who specialized in family trauma. I resisted at first, convinced therapy was for people weaker than me, but Rachel persisted until I agreed. Dr. Foster's office smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee, her kind eyes steady behind simple glasses. She did not rush me. She let the silence stretch until words stumbled out. I told her about favoritism, about the years of being invisible, about how $2 felt like my entire worth. She nodded gently and said, "Anna, you have been carrying a boulder that was never yours to hold." The sessions became a lifeline. Week after week, I unraveled knots I had tied around my own heart, learning that responsibility was not love, that endurance was not the same as being valued. Meanwhile, life outside therapy began to bloom. I landed a part-time position at a small architectural firm downtown, drafting layouts and shadowing senior designers. The paycheck was modest, but honest mine alone, untainted by my father's control. At night, Rachel dragged me to a community center pottery class claiming I needed something other than work and therapy. I scoffed until my hands sank into cool clay, the texture soothing and challenging all at once. The instructor, a silver-haired woman named Gloria, told me not to force the clay, but to listen to it. My first bowl was lopsided and ugly, but I stared at it with pride. It was mine, shaped by my hands, proof I could create beauty from nothing. Weeks turned into months. Rachel's apartment became a haven filled with laughter-shared meals and late-night conversations. Slowly, I stopped checking my phone for messages from my parents, though they came relentlessly. At first, there were pleas. Mom claiming her health was failing from stress. Dad demanding I return Sophie's car keys, though they were never mine. Then came threats, promises to cut me off financially, accusations that I had lost my mind. I learned to mute their numbers, the silence sweeter than any apology they never gave. Each ignored message felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. In class, I began to laugh again with Rachel. I began to dream again. My reflection in the mirror no longer looked like a girl bracing for a blow, but a woman standing at the edge of her own future. The piggy bank sat on the shelf beside my bed in Rachel's spare room, a reminder not of shame, but of how far I had come. Some nights, I dropped in another crisp $2 bill, turning their insult into my symbol of resilience. By spring, the apartment walls lined with uneven bowls and vases, my paycheck stretched to cover rent for my own small studio, and Dr. Foster smiled at my progress. Life was still fragile, but it was mine, and for the first time, that was enough. When the invitation to Cousin Emily's wedding arrived in late summer, the envelope heavy with gold calligraphy, my first instinct was to tear it in half. The thought of walking back into the orbit of Richard and Linda and Sophie felt like volunteering to be bruised all over again. Yet therapy had taught me that avoidance was not healing, it was hiding. I stared at the invitation for days until I finally booked a hotel room in Portland 4 blocks from the church. I would attend, but on my terms. I would not stay under their roof. I would not bend to their conditions, and I would not swallow my truth. By the time I arrived, the September sky burned with orange sunset, the city both familiar and foreign. I checked into my hotel, smoothed the fabric of the tailored navy dress I had saved for, and slipped the piggy bank and a folder of documents into my bag. The next afternoon hours before the ceremony, a message reached me through an aunt that Richard and Linda demanded to see me in the library of the rented estate. I walked there with my head-high heels clicking against polished stone, every step echoing with 20 years of pain sharpening into resolve. Inside, my parents waited with Sophie perched at their side. Richard's face flushed with authority. Linda clutched tissues, Sophie avoided my gaze. "Sit down," Richard ordered, his voice thick with bourbon. "We need to talk about respect." I remained standing, spine straight. "You hit me on Christmas morning," I said evenly. "You humiliated me. You gave Sophie a BMW and me $2. Now you want respect." Linda dabbed her eyes. "You are cruel, Anna, making me relive this." "My health has suffered since you left." Sophie piped up. "Dad lost his job. We are selling the house. This all started when you abandoned us." Their chorus of blame filled the room, but I did not bend. Instead, I unzipped my bag and laid a photo album on the table. The first page showed Sophie's 9th birthday with ponies and streamers, followed by my 10th with a cracked grocery store cake. I flipped page after page, Sophie showered in gifts, me standing alone with token offerings. I pulled out bank statements showing my student loans stacked against Sophie's fully funded art trips. I laid down report cards, scholarship letters, ignored graduation programs they had skipped. Each page slammed like a gavel. Richard's face reddened. "We did what we could," he stammered. "Lies," I said calmly. "Grandma's inheritance came before my freshman year. Dad's promotion doubled his salary. You had money. You chose Sophie." Silence fell, heavy relatives shifting at the edges of the room as they watched. Then, for the final blow, I placed the plastic piggy bank on the table and turned it over. Dozens of crisp $2 bills spilled across the wood, fluttering like a storm of green. Gasps rose around us. For every week since Christmas, I saved one, I explained, to remind myself of the value you assigned me. $2. Linda reached out trembling, but I pulled the bank back. This is not yours. This is mine. The library air grew taut, the weight of evidence undeniable. Sophie's eyes filled with something new, not arrogance, but shame. For once, she did not speak. Richard's jaw clenched, his voice breaking as he said, "We always knew you were strong, you would survive without us." And that I replied is the cruelty. Strength is not an excuse to withhold love. Responsibility is not a substitute for care. Around us, relatives whispered, some glaring at my parents, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Aunt Martha murmured, "We always suspected, but seeing it laid out like this." The truth was no longer a private wound, but a public reckoning. I gathered my papers and the piggy bank, leaving the bills scattered like evidence of a crime. I looked each of them in the eye. I do not want apologies. I want change. If you cannot give that, then you cannot have me. With that, I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, the room erupted in murmurs, Richard's voice rising in anger, Linda's tears louder, Sophie's silence thick. But I did not look back. The showdown was over. They had been exposed not just to me, but to everyone. In the days after the wedding, the ripple of that library confrontation spread quickly through the family, carried in hushed phone calls and long, whispered conversations at kitchen tables. My aunts, who had once looked at me with pity, now looked at Richard and Linda with barely disguised contempt. Uncles, who used to joke about Sophie's free rides, muttered that they had always known something was off. The truth could no longer be hidden under smiles. Richard's reputation cracked. At his office, word leaked that he had lost control of his household, that the respectable father he claimed to be had struck his daughter on Christmas morning and been confronted with proof of decades of favoritism. He had already been demoted during a round of layoffs, but now even former friends withdrew. Deals fell through, clients avoided his name, and whispers of his drinking grew louder. Linda tried to maintain her act of fragile motherhood, but family members now recognized her gaslighting for what it was. The woman who once played the martyr at every gathering was suddenly seen as a manipulator who let her husband's violence continue while she played the victim. Her tears drew no sympathy anymore. Sophie, too, faced consequences. The BMW she flaunted had already been repossessed when my father's finances crumbled, and now cousins who had once admired her Instagram feed of designer clothes and glamorous trips unfollowed quietly. Her phone no longer lit with invitations to parties. Creditors called her debt-mounted, and the charm that had once won her endless indulgence now seemed hollow. I did not smile at their unraveling, but I did not grieve either. Actions had consequences, and for the first time they were living inside theirs. From a distance, I received fragments of updates. Aunt Martha whispered that the Millers were selling the family house under the story of medical bills, though everyone knew it was because their finances had collapsed after years of bankrolling Sophie. Uncle Simon said Richard now sat alone at the bar, most nights eyes empty, while Linda busied herself with prescriptions. Sophie moved into a smaller apartment, her posts quieter, her tone subdued. Each piece of news carried both a sting and a strange relief. They were still my family by blood, and part of me would always ache that they chose cruelty over love, but I could no longer deny that justice was finally visible. The relatives who witnessed the evidence at the wedding did not let the story die. They spoke of the photo album, the bank statements, the pile of $2 bills. Those images clung to their minds like ink stains impossible to erase. No matter how Richard and Linda tried to spin it, the narrative had changed forever. I walked through Seattle streets with a lighter step, knowing that I was no longer the hidden scapegoat, but the one who spoke truth. Yet healing is complicated. At night, I sometimes lay awake in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should have felt joy at their downfall. Instead, I felt a bittersweet weight. They had hurt me deeply, but I had never wanted them destroyed, only forced to see. Therapy sessions with Dr. Foster helped me navigate those contradictions. She reminded me that accountability is not cruelty, that boundaries are not betrayal. What I felt was normal, she said, because love and pain are tangled threads when it comes to family. Over time, I accepted that my role was not to rescue them, nor to wish them ruin. My role was to stand firm in my own life, free and unbroken. Meanwhile, I continued building. At the architecture firm, I gained more responsibility shadowing senior engineers and drafting blueprints for projects that would rise tall against the skyline. Each completed plan felt like laying a stone in the foundation of a life they could not touch. My pottery shelves filled with bowls less crooked than the last proof of growth shaped by patient hands. Rachel celebrated every milestone with me, her laughter replacing the hollow echoes of my parents' neglect. When Christmas approached again, I decorated my apartment with simple lights and a small tree, friends gathering around with warmth and cheer. I placed the piggy bank on the mantel, no longer a wound, but a reminder. $2 had once symbolized my worth to them. Now, each $2 bill I added was a symbol of my survival. The consequences that fell on Richard, Linda, and Sophie were heavy and real. But the truest consequence was this: they no longer had power over me. Winter settled over Seattle with its misty mornings and long gray afternoons. Yet inside my small studio apartment, warmth blossomed in ways I had never known. By then, months had passed since the wedding confrontation, and I had carved out a life that belonged entirely to me. My internship at the architectural firm grew into a paid position, and soon my designs appeared in meetings where my voice mattered. I walked to work each day past buildings whose lines inspired me, whispering to myself that one day my own projects would stand just as proudly. The shelves along my walls filled with pottery pieces, some still uneven, but each one better than the last vessels that carried not just shape, but evidence of my healing. On the mantel, the piggy bank rested stuffed with crisp $2 bills that no longer mocked me, but reminded me of my strength, a ritual of transformation that turned insult into power. Life did not become a fairy tale, but it became real, and that was enough. Rachel remained my constant ally, cheering me on at every step, and through her, I met David Chin, a fellow designer at the firm, with a steady patience that drew me in slowly. At first, I resisted, convinced that love would become another burden, but his respect was quiet and unwavering. He asked me to coffee, listened to my ideas, and never once compared me to anyone else. Our conversations stretched into evenings, his presence steady beside me as I tested what it meant to trust. By spring, we were together not with fireworks, but with the calm certainty of building something solid. Holidays came again, the season that once symbolized humiliation and pain. This time, I hosted Christmas dinner in my apartment, the air thick with rosemary and garlic, the laughter of friends echoing off the walls. Rachel raised a glass and toasted to Anna, who builds bridges in every sense. David squeezed my hand, and I felt electricity not of fear, but of belonging. In that moment, I understood that family could be chosen, created from people who lifted rather than crushed. Yet closure did not come without echoes. My phone buzzed with messages from Sophie, shorter, now less arrogant. She admitted she had lost the BMW, admitted debt had swallowed her, admitted she did not know how to stand on her own. Once, I would have rushed to rescue her, but therapy had taught me compassion does not require sacrifice. I told her gently that I was sorry for her pain, but I could not fix it. I offered advice on budgeting, not a bed to sleep in. For the first time, she fell silent, perhaps realizing the burden would no longer shift onto me. Occasionally, a message arrived from Linda, laced with half apologies and pleas for forgiveness, followed by Richard's curt demands that I stop tarnishing the family name. I no longer answered. Their voices no longer defined me. Dr. Foster reminded me that boundaries are the truest expression of self-respect. The greatest gift I could give myself was peace, and peace meant distance. When the next Christmas dawned, I stood at my window watching the bay shimmer beneath pale light. Snow did not fall, but the city glowed with festive calm. Behind me, the table was set with dishes I had chosen, surrounded by friends who had become family. The piggy bank gleamed on the mantel, its round plastic body transformed from mockery into monument. I touched it gently and whispered, "You no longer own me." That night, as laughter filled my home, Rachel teased me about my crooked bowls. David carved the turkey with easy confidence, and my friends clinked glasses in joy. No one mentioned the Millers. No one compared me to Sophie. No one dismissed my worth. I realized then that closure is not the moment your enemies apologize or collapse. Closure is when their power fades into irrelevance. Healing is not forgetting the wound, but growing around it stronger, rooted alive. As the evening ended, I stepped onto my balcony, the cold air biting the lights of bridges spanning the water. I thought of all the years I had waited for recognition and realized I no longer needed it. I had built my own foundation, and it was stronger than anything they had ever offered. Worth is not measured in cars or gifts or approval. Worth is claimed by refusing to accept less than respect. I turned back to the room filled with warmth and chose to stay present, anchored in the life I had created. That was the real ending. That was the real beginning.